Hello and welcome back. You guys are here again? What are you thinking? At least I'm getting paid for this. I'm joking. Today, Revolution, Reaction, and Reform, early 19th century European politics. So the next unit will be on late 19th century European politics. Believe it or not, and you'll even see this if you look carefully in some of the quotes that I use in this PowerPoint, the sources, books on the 19th century, usually span the dates from exactly 1815 to exactly 1914. But not all of those years are in the 19th century, you say, and you'd be right to think that. But historians tend to like to divide and put into neat little boxes and categorize and label, as we have to do in every subject for our brains to retain things and understand them, at dates that make some sense, where something has changed and it's now different on the other side than just sort of random end of decades and the finales of one century and the inauguration of another one. So what historians are saying when a book title says European History 1815 to 1914 is that the first 15 years of the 19th century seems to have more in common with the 18th century, the Enlightenment, French Revolution, etc., and the first roughly 15 years of the 20th century have more in common with the 19th century. So 19th century Europe gets kind of skewed forward by about 15 years, and it does make some sense because in 1815, where we're beginning, Napoleon is defeated, and the Congress of Vienna gets together to make some new rules and try to put Europe back together again so that it won't be overrun in the future by France or anybody else, tipping the balance of power. 1914, yes, you guessed it, is the year that the Great War or World War I broke out. So that's another milestone, watershed event in European history, which of course we're covering soon. So we start with the seminal event at the very beginning of the century. Remember when we covered Napoleon, the rascal that he was defeated once and sent to exile on an island with British ships, circling the island to keep him there. And he escaped and came back, raised an army again, and went out and fought his biggest and last battle at Waterloo. That all while the Congress of Vienna was already in session, trying to figure out how to put the map of Europe back together. As you see the picture, I'm doing it right there. And in the middle of it, he had the audacity to interrupt their work, screw it up, and so when they came back the second time, after postponing, calling a timeout to deal with Napoleon yet again, not surprisingly, the terms were harsher toward France, and the powers were a bit more concerned with sort of holding France down. So the Congress of Vienna is legendary now. So putting Europe back together twice because of the French Revolution and then Napoleon. The leading statesmen from the five major powers we've already identified many times in this class included Clemens von Metternich, the host of the conference and really the star of the conference. It's fair to say that Clemens von Metternich was the dominant political figure in Europe in the first half of the 19th century. As it will also be fair to say, as I will, that a fellow German speaker, the Prussian, not this guy, Otto von Bismarck, is the leading statesman in all of Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. But at this point, he's not around yet, and Prussia sent one of its leading figures, Prince von Hardenberg. The Tsar of Russia sent himself, Alexander I, the guy who defeated Napoleon in Russia. The British sent their foreign minister, Castlereagh, another big name at the time, heavyweight statesman, diplomat. And France actually got to participate, surprisingly, and they had Prince Talleyrand on hand. And probably fortunate for them that they did. Talleyrand is a notorious figure in French and European history. He had been around all the way through the French Revolution, survived, and was Napoleon's foreign minister. Actually, he betrayed Napoleon a number of times, and Napoleon kept him on or brought him back, tolerated him because tolerated his disloyalty because he was talented. But he was talented without a lot of principles, and in fact, his sort of unprincipled nature, his amoral approach to politics, actually helped him navigate the rough waters of Europe and France in the 18th and 19th centuries. So he was known correctly as a slippery fish. Napoleon was somewhat afraid of him. That's probably part of the secret to him being able to stay on, even while being disloyal to Napoleon. I don't mean Napoleon was shaking with fear, but Talleyrand was a guy that, as foreign minister, had a lot of information, and Napoleon probably figured this guy could do damage if I fire him to my reputation, to whatever way. He's not the kind of guy you want on the wrong side of you, because he'll scheme and plot, and he's good at it. He's quite clever. To survive the French Revolution through all phases of it and sort of stay on the right side of it says something about someone. This is also true of Joseph Fouché, who was Napoleon's police chief, particularly of the secret police. And he had also survived the French Revolution by kind of doing the same kind of tap dance that Talleyrand appears to have done, which means you know which side to be on at the right time. You have to kind of know who's going to win any conflict, in the middle of a revolution that's continuing to change, back and forth in terms of who's in control day after day. You have to know who's going to win ahead of time. Either guess correctly or know somehow that you're on the right. You're going to stay on the right side. Otherwise, you were likely to be guillotined. So Talleyrand was a political survivor, if there ever was one. So France, in a sense, was in good hands, just because this guy's a brilliant poker player, and of course, France entered the negotiations here with the worst hand to play by far. Nonetheless, Talleyrand was probably the right guy for them to have there. But the star of the show was Clemens von Metternich, a West German by birth, but ended up serving basically his whole professional life under the Habsburg monarchy, and saw it through a true transition period from the latter years of the Holy Roman Empire to, on the other side of Napoleon, Austria being one a state among many European powers, but sort of with the empire part lopped off. And Metternich is usually given credit for a great deal of the transition, as he well deserves. He was a defender of the old order, a staunch conservative, but he wasn't an opponent of modernity. He was more of a transitional figure. I just kind of said he helped kind of bridge, Austria over from one side of the river to the other, between kind of the old way of doing things, the old order, and the new order, post-French Revolution, post-Napoleon. But he was a conservative. He knew he was a brilliant guy, and so he knew that Europe was not going to ever going to be able to go back to pre-1789 French Revolutionary days, ever. But he would have preferred that, and he was trying to kind of hold the line as much as possible, but he was a flexible conservative, as all of those that survived politics in this era had to be. But he did oppose liberalism. He did oppose nationalism, as we'll see here and going forward. It makes perfect sense that he would oppose nationalism, which we've already talked about at some length in this class. The reason being, of the five great European powers, Austria was the one that was the most multicultural and multi-ethnic. So to be in favor of nationalism as the leader or one of the leaders of the Habsburg monarchy, the Austrian Habsburg state, was to basically commit suicide, or promote committing suicide, because there were many kind of small nationalisms within the Habsburg domains. The Serbians, the Hungarians, the Czechs, and on and on and on. If all of those groups are allowed to bask in nationalist glory and nationalist identity, it could lead to one rebellion after another and could cause your state, Austria, to be blown to smithereens, to just crack up. So he had no choice but to be against nationalism. But he was also against liberalism. Remember, liberalism had been around for a while, going back to the Enlightenment. And, I mean, the ism part of it was new, but the ideas, pro-capitalist, basic freedoms, civil liberties, he was staunchly opposed to this kind of thing. And because he had more pull and more clout, maybe more ability than any other political leader in Europe of his day, he was able to, for a time after the Congress of Vienna, and partly because of what he laid down at that Congress, to kind of bring back conservative principles and conservative politics for a time. There was a window of opportunity, as we'll see, for about 15 years, 1815 to 1830, and he saw that window and sort of jumped through it and was able to pull much of the rest of Europe with him. But it was, in a sense, kind of a rear guard effort to buy time. I think he probably knew that it wouldn't last, but he was holding on as long as he could, knowing that he'd have to change, knowing that he'd have to, sort of bow to what was practical. The underlying social forces, which don't explain everything in history, and they don't here either, but economic forces, the value system that goes along with industrial capitalism, etc., etc., secularization, more and more Europeans losing their ability to believe in traditional religion, or at least engage, in formal religion. All of those things benefited the liberals and their philosophy and ideology, and sort of went against the conservative philosophy. And he certainly knew that as well. So in a sense, he was brilliantly buying time and trying to make the conservatives make them over into something relevant where they could hold on to as much conservatism as possible. But to do that, they'd have to give up some reforms that they otherwise wouldn't want on the other side. So it's a careful balancing act, and he did it remarkably well. A very new, just came out I think this year, biography of Metternich, which I finished fairly recently, says traditionally Metternich is still seen as a politician not quite of his own time, meaning kind of too old-fashioned, but nevertheless he stepped into 19th century modernity. He knew how to analyze the problems of these new times, and he looked deeper than many of his contemporaries into the social transformations that were taking place, and developed a new and original position from which to meet the challenges thrown up by the laboratory of modernity, as it's sometimes called. In contrast to his social peers, other statesmen, political leaders of the age, he did not demonize market forces, industrialization, or technological progress. He did not fatalistically accept the crisis of his times either. They were an intermediate stage, in his view, and in a more distant future, it would again become possible to live in peace, to live according to his motto, strength in law. So this guy really was sort of a bridge, a transitional figure that did his work with a consummate skill. So what did they talk about? What did they decide at the Congress of Vienna? Well, of course, much of it was how to keep France from making the same kind of trouble in the future. Keep in mind, though Napoleon certainly is a singular figure and was seen as such correctly then, they weren't just thinking about Napoleon. France was the most populous country west of Russia, had the biggest economy, in Europe. So it was a threat even without Napoleon. So they're concerned about making sure France is kind of hemmed in, bottled in going forward. But there was also a concern, rightly so, for the future, not just to keep France down, but to try to minimize tensions throughout Europe. And this is part of the ongoing, this part isn't new, balance of power way of thinking that goes back to at least 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia, ending the 30 Years' War. So everybody sort of compromised, and they sort of divided up the map. It's like they were playing Risk. You remember that game? I remember it fondly from my childhood, which does put a certain date on me. But nonetheless, this is kind of what they were doing. So just looking at the major points that I've put on the screen here, France paid a large indemnity, so they were forced to pay a great deal for the damage caused by Napoleon. And France was occupied, at least parts of France were occupied until paid. The old Bourbon monarchy was restored yet again, at least for the time being, excuse me. Prussia was granted control of the Rhineland, which is in Western Europe, not contiguous with Prussia heretofore, and part of Saxony. Russia obtained Finland and part of Poland. The poor Poles have been getting divided up already in our class, and will be divided up again by other neighboring bigger powers. Austria got back Lombardy in northern Italy. England received strategic naval bases, Malta, Ceylon, off the coast of India. Germany was organized into a 38 and 39 state confederation known as the German Confederation, very creatively titled. And many pre-revolutionary Napoleonic rulers were actually restored to power. Spain, Portugal, the Papal States, etc., etc. So, and that all of that has Metternich's mark all over it. So just take the last one. Right, a conservative leader with consummate skill knows he can't hold back the tide of modernity and liberalism, and isn't even totally against all features of it, but is doing as much as he can within reason, within what's realistic. So he sees it as a move for stability and tradition that will bring stability by putting some old crowned heads from the known previously ruling families in Europe. So what was achieved at all this? Did they succeed? Did it work? Well, assessing the Congress is difficult. Traditionally, most historians, until fairly recently, overwhelmingly thought that the Congress of Vienna was a success. I would still say that's most likely to be true, but in more recent years, there's been cold water thrown in it by other historians that have come along. So now I think it's a little bit more open to question, and so the question will probably remain. One of the reasons it at least seemed for so long like it was a success story is that it is true that the 19th century, again 1815 to 1914 more or less, was a relatively peaceful century in European history. Certainly way more so than the bloody violent 20th century that we're unfortunately going to have to get to in this class, and even more so than the earlier centuries we've looked at. That might not be a cause and effect relationship. It could be just a case of coincidence, but and coincidences do happen in history and in the world. But it does look like something happened at Vienna that worked. Now, saying that the 19th century was a relatively peaceful century makes, of course, the word relatively the key word. Doesn't mean there were no wars and there was no violence, but there was actually less, and markedly so, than both before and after. So, based on that alone, historians have made, and other things too, but have made the argument that what they did here helped to establish a basic relative harmony and peace for close to 100 years. The concert of Europe, as it became known. Concert, not like people with instruments playing music, but like people acting in concert, which means the same thing. So working together. So harmony between nations, internal stability within each nation. And this was also one of the major goals of Metternich as a arch conservative, going back to our look at the isms in our previous unit. Remember that the conservatives were always concerned with tradition, maintaining as much tradition as possible, because they believed they brought sort of stability and law and order that was good for society, good for human beings, and Metternich is certainly displaying that here through his handiwork. Again, I don't want to overstate this. It's not just Metternich that's doing all this, but he's the leading hand. However, as I mentioned, Historians have more recently come to question what the Congress actually achieved, and some of the critique has included their failure to deal with liberal and nationalist goals. And sure enough, we know Metternich was against both liberalism and nationalism. Our own lovable Professor Perry says that some historians today are impressed by the peacemaker's success in restoring the balance of power that effectively stabilized international relations. No one country was strong enough to dominate the continent, and no great power was so unhappy that it resorted to war to undo the settlement. So Perry is kind of cutting things down the middle there, as a textbook author usually does, appropriately. So he is saying that some, historians still think that this was a very successful conference, a very successful set of agreements, that came out of this great Congress. So the Informal Concert of Europe, and it was informal. They didn't establish an international body like the League of Nations or like the United Nations today. It was more informal, but it was sort of the same idea. Since it wasn't a formal institution, they didn't meet regularly or 24/7. But what they agreed to do, and they did actually make an agreement to do this at the Congress of Vienna, was to get together when there was a crisis, and they knew that there was a chance that every time they got together, any single time they got together, they wouldn't be able to stop the crisis from blowing up into a war or getting into turning into a bigger war. But the idea was we may be able to minimize difficulties and maybe solve problems completely at times. So Perry again says Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain agreed to act together to preserve the territorial settlement of the Congress of Vienna and the balance of power. Metternich intended to use the concert to maintain harmony among nations and internal stability within nations. Towards this end, conservatives in their respective countries censored books and newspapers, imprisoned liberal activists, and suppressed national uprisings. And here again, we see then that Metternich sort of was able to reach out beyond Austria and get the ear of other statesmen, starting at the Congress of Vienna, but then by keeping in correspondence and cooperation with them to sort of get them, lean on them by using his influence and his ability to crack down on liberal and nationalist goals and groups in their respective countries. And he actually did have some success doing so, even as far away as Great Britain, in a political system as different as Britain's was. Great Britain by this time is ever so slowly moving towards a democratic system, and yet Metternich still, at least for a time, able to prevail upon them to follow some of these sort of larger directives. And he doesn't have the authority, of course, to do so. Any country could, and sometimes did, oppose him or just flat out refuse to do what he was counseling. But he was, I think, he was able to get a lot of what he wanted to do. Another simple way to put this would be that Metternich, for the time being, convinced European leaders, some of them anyway, for a time, I'm going to qualify everything I say carefully, to pay more attention to internal strife as opposed to external problems. So saying more or less, look, okay, we've been worried for so long, rightfully so, about wars with each other and amongst each other and foreign policy and Napoleon's and overrunning the European continent, etc., etc. But what we need to do now is to think of this as not so much country versus country as rich versus poor, powerful versus not powerful. And we, the leaders of these countries, are on the powerful side, and we have to unite together to stay on top of the masses of unpowerful, because they are the masses, and the advantage they do have is they outnumber us by a lot. So in a sense, he sort of skewed and changed their way of thinking for the time being, and it did work. This is where the quote I read from the recent biography of Metternich moments ago talked about him having sort of his own new sort of approach to sort of dealing with the challenges of the time. It's one of the ways that he had sort of a new approach. The Quadruple Alliance was four of the major powers in a kind of a separate alliance, but they participated as a whole in the Congress system that went beyond just the five powers of Europe as well. But it was more, it was mostly the five powers that we've already identified, working together, cooperating to crack down on internal dissent. And you see that there was lots of internal dissent after 1815, and it is here we see the window of opportunity, 1815 to roughly 1830. So about 15 years of a conservative window. And this is one of the testimonials to Metternich's gifts, that he saw the window and capitalized on it. We talked earlier about how Napoleon saw his window of opportunity in his career at a certain time and leapt through that window. Metternich is doing something similar here. Well, why is there a window of opportunity for conservatism, that particular ism and conservative ideas and ideology at this time? I think the most outstanding reason is a simple one, and that is, and I think I've mentioned it in a different respect before in another lecture, that Europeans were sick and tired of warfare, both civil war home and foreign wars, and they were happy, content with someone just saying, I'm here to preserve law and order, stability. You're not going to have many rights. There's not going to be any equality, not so much freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I'm not into those things, but I will keep it safe to kind of walk the streets. And many Europeans are saying, deal, I'll take it. Even Napoleon had promised to do that. It's part of what made him popular in France, but we know what he did with all of that, which was sort of, he maintained or brought back law and order, stability in the streets of France, but then, caused his people to go get killed in his own foreign wars. So Metternich sees an opportunity here, primarily because Europe is just, exhausted and terrified by years and years of trauma and violence. In 1820, between 20 and 23, there was a revolution in Spain, which was crushed with the aid of 10,000. I put my comma in the wrong place. I was going to say that's a little bit too large. 10,000 French troops. So that's a good, tangible example of what Metternich was, sort of trying to do here. This has his fingerprints yet again all over it. What do I mean? Well, why doesn't Spain just put down its own rebellion? Well, it could, and maybe it would have anyway without the French assistance. But this is the idea, right, that others are picking up on, whereby Metternich says, hey, we have to help each other police our own populations to make sure the poor people, the masses don't rise up successfully against one of us. We're all going to protect each other's, we've got each other's backs, and we're going to protect, my throne, and you're going to all protect your throne, and so forth. In 1821, there was an uprising in the kingdom of the Two Sicilies and Piedmont, which is Italy, put down by Austrian troops. In 1825, there was this Decembrist revolt in Russia. This time, there was no need to send troops, and it's pretty far away, and I think the Russian Tsar doesn't welcome assistance anyway, whatever Russian Tsar it is. In this case, a new Tsar had just become Tsar when this happened. Coincidentally, Nicholas I, when the Decembrists rose up in 1825. This was a plot and a rebellion orchestrated primarily by officers in the military, which is dangerous if you're the ruler. Why was it them? There were some radical students and other groups involved as well. Well, part of the reason is that many of the officers had been among the few Russians who had been to Central and Western Europe, because the officers had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, and some of them had gone all the way to Paris. So, well, who cares? Well, they had seen what Western Europe was like, and now they can come back and tell their comrades in Russia, wait a minute, in Paris, they have this and they get to do that, and we don't have any of that stuff here. And so it helped to kind of fuel their growing anger at their own leadership, their own monarchy, the czar, the political institutions, the social system, the values of Russia, which didn't afford the people anything like the same kind of freedoms and something moving towards equality like you saw in France, or we see in France, Great Britain, etc. So army officers that had been to Western Europe and seen how much, in a sense, better things were there would be a likely group to come back and stir up trouble because they want things, they want to force things to be better here. Tsar Nicholas put the December revolt down with brutal force. I forget the numbers of killed and wounded, and in the process started a secret police that became notorious for its cruelty and frightened the population. It developed a real reputation for it. In fact, the Russians have been known for secret police ever since, through the communist years and even out of the communist years up until the present. Their intelligence services have always been top-notch, first-rate, and they continue to be today. It's one of the consistent features of Russian history. So the window of opportunity for conservatism lasted about 15 years, and kind of right on cue, 15 years later, come the revolutions of 1830 to 1832. France, yet another French regime toppled by revolution. It won't be the last either in this class. So the French set forces in motion in 1789 that didn't really stop. And to some degree, it's true to say that the other countries underneath here, below France on our list, took their cue from Paris. When Europeans after 1789 see the barricades going up again in Paris, they think, okay, I guess the world, European society, culture is ripe for revolution. Keep in mind, there was some already sense of one culture, since they're all Christians. They'd all been Catholics at one point. Now Europe is divided between Protestants and Catholics and Jews, but there is some still semblance of cultural affinity. So, and the countries are close enough together where word gets around, ideas get around. So it's not that surprising when you think about it, look into it, that France was kind of always seen as the bellwether of revolution. So in that same year, Italy and Austrian forces put down rebellions in the Italian states. In Poland, the people rose up for independence against Russia. Once again, Russian Tsarist forces crushing this time a Polish insurrection. Russia had subdued Poland and carved it up, as I said, for not the last time. And when the Polish uprising, they had the audacity to rise up against Russian rule, it was summarily ended. In 1830 also in Belgium, the Catholic country breaks away from Protestant Holland. So a slightly different type of violent conflict here. This was a splintering of countries, and the Catholic part of Holland, that they'd been together before, they break into a separate country, which still exists to this day. Though Belgium doesn't come up a great deal in this class, it will again once or twice. Nothing against Belgium; it's beautiful, by the way, and they have my favorite soccer player in the world. So, but he doesn't fit our time period, so we can't cover him. So when France rises up, people listen. The revolution of 1830, right, in France, kind of the starting point for revolution across Europe. And the result of that revolution, this revolution, was what's known as the July Monarchy. Why the July Monarchy? Because sort of the culminating events happened in July of 1830, which are pictured here in this portrait of the violence sort of across the Seine River and one of the bridges, I forget which one that is, And I ask, was all of this a product of the French Revolution of 1789 and 1795? In part. I mean, there were certainly lots of different reasons from revolution to revolution in France why the revolution happens, but nonetheless, there was chronic instability in French politics, and really I think in French political culture and French political thought from 1789 on. I did delve into the question, though I didn't answer it definitively, since you can't really, whether or not the French Revolution, the first one, was good for France or Europe or not. And I sort of argued on both sides of that. But one of the things that I said, if you remember, perhaps you don't, was that it does seem to have created long-term instability that you could argue may only ended fairly recently in France and may even still not be over. They have a whole different list of problems, but there's still a tendency towards a certain political kind of impatience in France, not as much as there once was.